We're now moving on to the last sessions of the day. So we have a presentation, a thought leadership presentation coming up, a fantastic one from Fluor, Marc Heerink, who's the VP of Business Development and Strategy for Fluor, for production fuels and energy transition. And it tailors in nicely before our final panel on decarbonisation. So the actual presentation is titled Decarbonisation, Targeting the Higher Emitting Industries, Status of Technology Approaches, and Examples of Projects Being Implemented. So a really, really suitable title, especially given we've got a very similar theme coming up after this as well. So over to you, Marc.
Good afternoon all. My name is Marc Heerink, and in Fluor I'm responsible for business development in the production and fuels business line, which covers more traditional upstream and downstream, but nowadays more so the energy transition, and in that renewable fuels, carbon capture, green and blue hydrogen gasification, and general efficiency improvement, of course. But let's start. Colleagues, we have a lot of ground to cover and some really interesting pictures and graphs that I want to show to you. So please be prepared that I will use some pace today and only briefly touch on some slides and the point I want to make with them. I would like to talk with you about what we as a major international EPC company see right now in actual project activity and the decarbonization space, with a bit more focus today on carbon capture. The graph on the right is just a little illustration of the absolute necessity to act. So the complex pie chart on the right shows us that carbon emission stems from a very broad spectrum of sources, and none of them truly dominant. Energy use in industry in the top right corner is one of the big contributors, as we see, and in that segment the bigger emitters are the steel industry with nearly 8% of emissions, chemicals and petrochemicals with nearly 4%. But also in the industry segment, it's worth recognizing that the cement industry is a bigger contributor with approximately 3% of the emissions and worth targeting therefore. Somewhat hidden within these categories is a major contributor, as we will see on the next bubble charts, the power generation business. So what do we need to do to achieve our Paris target ambitions? Most all of it. There is no dominant low-hanging fruit in the overall spectrum. In industry, for example, we need to target all the things that you can do, from efficiency improvement to fuel switching to carbon capture in all different aspects. Just as an example of a massive investment in efficiency improvement and electrification is the laser program by Marathon in the USA. But also in the Netherlands, for example, we see large investments in electrifying furnaces or heaters in actual projects, some of them already realized. I want to focus next a bit on decarbonization and specifically carbon capture. This CO2 emissions bubble chart of CO2 emitters in the Benelux provides a good indication of the bigger emitters and what we should prioritize on. Industry is indicated in dark blue bubbles. You will note the larger refineries and chemical complexes, but also 2 large steel plants. Power plants are indicated in light blue, and it is to be noted that especially coal-fired power plants are worthy targets for carbon capture. And shown in green are some waste incinerators. Similarly, I thought it would be interesting to show you the same chart for the United Kingdom. Some of the emitter sizes are a bit suspect in this diagram, I find. I took it from a report in the United Kingdom, but the trend is what is important, and so is the clustering. Again, the bigger emitters are power plants, the steel industry, refineries, and large chemical sites, the cement industry, and the fertilizer business. 6 industrial targets, as you see, are targeted by the United Kingdom to be actioned. So as I said earlier, the data shows we need to do all of it, attack from multiple angles, including carbon capture. Carbon capture is in fact a very good method for the following reasons. It has the potential in it to reduce very large volumes of CO2 quickly. It can be realized in the short term, crucial in terms of carbon budget management. And it can be quickly applied to produce blue hydrogen, as it seems a necessary step before enough green hydrogen can be produced. Last but not least, as you can see in the graph on the right from PBL, in a report from 2020, it's one of the most cost-effective methods for governments to subsidize decarbonization. What do we need to put in place to be able to drive carbon capture? At a high level, let me put it simple. You need a place to sequester the gigantic volumes of CO2 that you will capture, or find a way to use the CO2. How can you do this? You can find an empty gas field to store it in, sedimentary basins or aquifers, etc. Secondly, you need clear legislation that drives for carbon capture. My personal opinion is that despite all the beautiful aspirations and words in the European Union, we are in fact not yet clear enough. In the world, we can conclude that some 191 geographies signed up for the Paris Agreement. 134 of them set net zero targets with a date also, but only some 32 have clear goals in law. If you put goals in law, and perhaps even more important, when you put clear incentives and or penalties into law, the market will do its own thing. And I'm positively surprised by the United States in that aspect, certainly certain states in the USA, and Canada also in that respect. We see a strong increase in carbon capture project activity as a result of that. And there are multi-projects in advanced stage in North America, and Fluor is in fact engaged in a number of them. Same thing for renewable fuels, by the way. In North America, there is clearer legislation that promotes the, putting in place plants that produce renewable fuels, and as a result, there is a lot of project activity. Let's take a quick look at two different technologies that exist to capture CO2 on a large-scale basis and on a proven basis: post-combustion and pre-combustion. In post-combustion capture, the CO2 is removed after combustion of the fossil fuel, and CO2 is captured from flue gases at for example, power stations or other point sources. Pre-combustion capture we see widely applied in, for example, the fertilizer business and hydrogen production. In the latter case, a syngas reacts with added steam and is shifted into CO2 and H2. The CO2 can then be captured from a relatively pure exhaust stream. There's also other means, like you can burn your fossil fuels with pure oxygen and then sequester the CO2. And then there is direct air capture, of course. So what is being done in the pre and post carbon capture space? These are great telling charts, with a big thank you to Bloomberg. It shows you what I said earlier, that North America is actually ahead in planning, and that in Europe, the Netherlands and the UK are front runners. Not coincidental, there is a lot of industry in these countries, of course, but also both have access to the right geology. They plan to sequester the CO2 in empty gas fields off the coast in the North Sea. The bar chart on the right shows that we haven't done all that much in carbon capture to date. And what was done was mostly capturing carbon in natural gas production, upstream, and in the fertilizer business. Capturing carbon from flue gases at a very large scale is newer to industry, and we should all recognize this and adapt our execution and contracting strategies for projects like that. As you will note, we expect major capacity growth globally in that segment now and in the years to come, especially in the power segment and in the blue hydrogen segment and the steel industry. So I don't want to bang the Fluor drum too much, but just very briefly on this slide, the available fluorocarbon capture technologies for various types of emissions and emitters, pre-combustion shown with blue and green arrows, and post-combustion with yellow arrows. In the blue box in the middle, you can see the technology that Fluor offers. If you have questions, feel free to approach me. I wanted to highlight to you what actual project activity is taking place on the next couple of slides I mentioned already we see significant project activity in energy efficiency optimization projects. These are fairly easy to do and can be implemented quickly with an immediate return for the client. We also see quite an interest right now in an implementation of electrification projects. First project highlight that is a good indication of increasing project activity in the decarbonization space is the Portos Project in Rotterdam. Scope is a central CO2 gathering line, indicated in purple on this slide, that companies in the industrial zone of Rotterdam can inject their captured CO2 into. At the coast, this CO2 stream is then compressed in a compressor station for further injection in an empty gas field in the North Sea. The project is lining up for EPC tendering as we speak, and as that starts, individual carbon capture projects will follow. As mentioned earlier, in the United Kingdom, there are 6 significant clusters targeted for carbon capture. These represent about 50% of the UK's industrial CO2 emissions. In these two, the two prioritized clusters are HyNet, Merseyside, and the East Coast Cluster, which includes the Humber and Teesside clusters. As Fluor, we see various parts of these programs coming to fruition now. One example being the carbon capture study that we recently did for Hansel Heidelberg, a cement company in the HyNet cluster. Their CO2 would be inserted into that central CO2 gathering line shown in orange, and here too it will be sequestered into an empty gas field. So what does a post-combustion carbon capture plant look like? These pictures on this slide show such a plant for a small to medium-sized carbon capture facility in Bellingham, USA. It captured CO2 from flue gas from a natural gas-fired combined cycle power plant, about 140,000 tons per annum. That was then used as food-grade CO2 for the beverage industry. What you will note on this slide is that even for this smaller sized facility, it's already a significant plant with large sized main equipment. But the next slides will give you more depth to that. When we come to a large carbon capture plant, this rendering from a feed project that we recently completed gives a great view of the magnitude and complexity these plants do have. This is a 1.5 million ton per annum carbon capture plant on gas-fired turbines of a power plant in India. The CO2 will then be used for enhanced oil recovery in a nearby oil field owned by the same customer. Note the very large direct cooling column in the top right corner of this plant to cool the flue gas to acceptable temperatures. With next to it on the left, the very high amine absorber column with the little stack on top. In these very large carbon capture plants, the diameters of the absorber column are often in the 17 to 25 meters range, depending on the CO2 concentration in the flue gas also. This means typically that the column will need to be field fabricated. Status of this project, it's gearing up for EPC price preparation. This is just a quick snapshot of a carbon capture plant added to a world-scale plant, methanol plant. It's a post-combustion effort also. Towards the left bottom of this plant, you will note that large direct contact cooler again, and a little bit to the left of it, the very large amine absorber. Then, this is the Future of Downstream conference, of course, so I wanted to share this project also with you. We see quite a lot of these projects in North America currently, where existing refineries are revamped to convert them to become renewable diesel producing plants. This is supported in North America through tax incentives, and by virtue of that, the industry is rapidly adjusting and reacting to that. Also in Europe, there are a number of clients quite active in this arena already, Neste and Preem, to name a few. Last but not least, a very large carbon capture project that has actually been built already and is in operation since 2015. one of the largest carbon capture plants in operation today. In the top 3, if my data is correct, it captures about 1.2 million ton per annum of CO2. This is a pre-combustion type plant, so basically it produces blue hydrogen. Right. The steel industry is what I want to say a few words about next. What are the main decarbonization activities in the steel industry right now? Basically, to produce steel with reduced carbon emissions, you can follow 3 routes. Clean the energy inputs, as you can see in the top. Clean the steel production itself. And thirdly, clean the remaining carbon emissions. Next slide, we will look in a little bit more detail at these categories. So, on this slide, you see the same 3 methods coming back, with on the left the investments that can be made into using electricity from renewable sources like wind and solar energy, or the use, for example, of green or blue hydrogen. I can say the following. Fluor sees significant movement in decarbonization in this industry. Players like US Steel, ArcelorMittal, and Tata are all embarking on decarbonization projects and are in earlier or later stages of projects to reduce emissions during the steelmaking. Electric arc furnace projects, for example, we see a multitude of them, or using DRIs. And at the same time, we see the first steps to making plans for green or blue hydrogen usage. Then thirdly, there are the emission cleaning steps, carbon mitigation, if you will. These steps currently seem to be trailing the middle category a little bit, but likely these will be implemented as well. We have all seen the announcements made by ArcelorMittal. I think they will invest many billions of dollars in steel plants around the world in a decarbonization effort. Countries included are, for example, Belgium, Spain, France, Canada. And as said, Tata is making similar steps, and so does, for example, US Steel. And with that, I've come to the end of my presentation, and I would like to open it up for Q&A, please.
Hi, Marc. Thank you for joining me. A wonderful presentation on the real pressing issues. I think what you've mentioned in there about the steel industry, I've been doing a bit of studying on that. That's concerning. I think one of the areas that a high concern for decarbonising. Just a couple of questions, Marc, because obviously the ability to see the captured CO2 appears to be a major element of the carbon capture and obviously the storage road to success. We talked about this yesterday in the closing panel a lot as well. Can you tell me a bit more about that? And also, how do operators seem to handle this?
Yeah. Yeah, the whole path to sequestering CO2 is a key element to be able to do carbon capture. And there are all sorts of technologies under development to utilize the CO2. And we see them on LinkedIn. We see beautiful pictures, but it's all microscopic. It's very small. If you look at the gigantic volumes of CO2 that will need to be, find a spot. And I mentioned earlier already in my own presentation 2 locations in the Netherlands. For example, there's the Portos, Athos, and Aramis projects, the 3 musketeers, as we probably all know.
Yeah.
And they were all related to having central capturing systems and then injecting the CO2 in an empty gas field in the North Sea. Likewise, the United Kingdom has 2 of those clusters where they will inject it into an empty gas field. For that reason, the UK and the Netherlands are ahead of the rest of Europe. But there's also in Canada, there is, near the Athabasca oil sands, etc. There's a lot of industry in Alberta. They are talking about a central trunk line that will gather CO2 and then inject it in a suitable geology. And in Houston, there is a project that looks at putting in place a central gathering line and then injecting it in an empty gas field in the Gulf. Last but not least, I want to mention, this is interesting. If you're near a geology where there is oil production and you can use the CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, like I showed on that one active project that just passed FEED, there will be the project will be way more economical because people actually pay money then for the CO2 to use it to enhance production.
It's the money, isn't it, as well? Because it's, people talk about the expense and everyone wants, return on investment so quickly. And I don't think it's going to happen in anytime soon in this sector. In terms of carbon capture plants, obviously that you mentioned, they're on a world scale. When applied to, let's say, large power plants, can you tell us a little bit more about the level of investment that's required? And also, I want to bolt on a third question. What is a good execution and contracting strategy for these types of projects?
Yeah, thanks. These plants do have a tendency to become quite costly. We see, let me actually split it up for you. We see literally hundreds of potential projects being planned in the small emitter category, maybe up to 100,000 ton per annum. It is fair at this stage to wonder, by the way, how many will actually go ahead. These plants typically go up to about $100 million in investment cost. Medium-sized capture plants, then, a pretty big range, between 100 million and 600 million. And when we talk about those large carbon capture plants on large coal-fired power plants, for example, they can go well above $600 million. In fact, they could go above $1.5 billion in total installed cost for a client. And it's important to realize that these are engineered plants. It's not just something you buy off the shelf. Give me one of those. They need to be fine-tuned to the point source you want to capture from. And one can make decisions based on client preferences that will optimize CAPEX versus OPEX or vice versa. Very, very important. A post-combustion carbon capture plant has a pretty healthy steam consumption, for example. It uses a fair bit of energy. This can be optimized, however, versus some CAPEX investment. So this has to be accounted for in mention. You asked about the contracting strategy. And we see two dominant strategies right now, and a third one looming also. Clients that will do a licensor selection for such a, say, for example, post-combustion strategy. Apologies for that. And after the licensor selection, they will pick one and continue into pre-feed and feed with them, and then go for a financial investment decisions. Or there is clients that will do a licensor selection and pick two contractors and then do a dual feed competition. And both will come up with a solution and a price. The client will select one of them and continue with them into the EPC or EPCM stage. And unfortunately, we also see clients, mostly in the slightly smaller size category, that are going right now out with very minor specs, a project spec, and then just expect a lump sum EPC price for that. I don't see a lot of future for those strategies, but I could be wrong.
Well, we don't know, but you're on the right path, Marc. I think it was really insightful what you presented as well. I think it's it's a tremendously big issue, especially when you come to carbon capture. I've sort of covered so many topics on this, and I think we're getting there, but it's a little bit slow. I think we need to accelerate that somewhat, especially over the next sort of few months. But it was brilliant to have you, Marc. Marc obviously represents Fluor, who are an innovation partner for the event. Please go and see him at the stand. Please contact Marc as well for any extra information about what he's presented. It's really, really wonderful stuff. But Marc, thank you for joining me, and we hopefully speak again very soon. Fantastic. Really, really, really good areas. I'm very passionate about the carbon capture side. I sort of was covering a little bit of the work that was done by some oil and gas companies in Houston and the Gulf of Mexico, and it's interesting that obviously Marc referenced that as well. So fantastic presentation.